There's a kind of suffering that doesn't come from failure. It comes from realizing that the life you were promised doesn't feel real anymore. And that kind of pain is dangerous not because it breaks you, but because it makes you question everything you believed was supposed to work. If you've been feeling tired, disconnected, or quietly stuck, this isn't a message to push you forward. It's a message about what your suffering is actually trying to tell you. There's a quiet kind of pain you don't talk about. Not because it's small, but because you're tired of explaining it. You wake up, you function. You do what's expected. From the outside, it looks like you're holding it together. But inside, something feels heavy. Like you're carrying a weight you never agreed to pick up. And the worst part isn't that life is hard. It's that you don't understand why it has to feel this way. You've probably asked yourself questions you don't say out loud. Why does it hurt even when nothing is wrong? Why do other people seem to move forward while you feel stuck in the same place? Why does motivation disappear the moment you need it most? And when you look for answers, most of what you hear sounds empty. Be positive. Stay strong. Everything happens for a reason. But none of that helps when the pain is real. None of that explains the long nights, the quiet frustration, the sense that you're falling behind in a race you never chose to run. Here's a truth most people avoid saying plainly. Pain doesn't always come from failure. Sometimes it comes from seeing clearly for the first time. There's a moment in life, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, when illusions start to crack. You realize that effort doesn't always lead to reward, that being kind doesn't guarantee being treated kindly, that doing everything right doesn't protect you from loss, disappointment, or loneliness. And when that realization hits, it can feel like something inside you breaks. That's the moment many people lose motivation. Not because they're weak, but because the story they were living by no longer makes sense. If that's where you are right now, tired, confused, quietly hurting, this isn't a speech meant to push you or pressure you. This is a conversation about the truth of suffering, not the dramatic version. Not the romantic one, the real one we all meet, eventually. Because when you understand what suffering actually is and what it is, and something begins to change. Not all at once, not magically, but honestly. And honesty, even when it hurts, is where real strength begins. Most people think they lose motivation because they're lazy, unfocused, or not strong enough. That's not the real problem. The real problem is misunderstood suffering. We grow up absorbing a simple promise. If you work hard, stay patient, and do the right things, life will eventually feel stable and meaningful. So when pain shows up anyway, it doesn't just hurt, it confuses us. And confusion drains energy faster than pain ever could. Here's what often happens psychologically. At some point, life stops matching the expectations you built. Maybe you tried for years and didn't get where you thought you'd be. Maybe relationships disappointed you. Maybe you sacrificed parts of yourself, thinking it would pay off later, and later never came. When effort and outcome disconnect for too long, the mind starts protecting itself. You stop trying, not because you don't care, but because caring feels dangerous. Hope starts to feel naive. Ambition feels like a setup for disappointment. This is where many people quietly break. They don't collapse dramatically. They still go to work. They still answer messages. They still smile at the right moments. But inside, there's a growing sense of numbness. Another layer of the problem is comparison. You scroll. You observe. You listen to other people's milestones. Someone your age is ahead. Someone else seems fulfilled, confident, settled. And even if you know those images aren't the full truth, your nervous system doesn't care. It still interprets them as evidence that you are behind. That creates a silent pressure. I should be more motivated by now. I shouldn't still be struggling. Something must be wrong with me. So suffering turns inward. Instead of saying, life is difficult, you start saying, I am failing at life. That shift is devastating, because once pain becomes personal, once you believe it means something about your worth, motivation doesn't just fade. It shuts down completely. There's also exhaustion no one warns you about. Emotional fatigue. Trying to stay hopeful while being disappointed over and over again takes a toll. trying to stay positive when reality keeps contradicting you. Wears you thin. Trying to be strong without being understood slowly empties you. So if you feel unmotivated, flat, or disconnected, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you've been carrying pain without a framework that makes sense of it. And when suffering feels meaningless, the mind does the only thing it knows how to do: it pulls back. But here's the turning point most people miss. The problem isn't that you're suffering. The problem is that you were taught the wrong story about what suffering means. And once that story changes, your relationship with Panand, with life itself, can begin to shift. Here's where things start to change. Not by fixing your pain, but by understanding it differently. Most people believe suffering is a sign that something has gone wrong, that it means you took the wrong path, made the wrong choices, or fell behind in some invisible race. But suffering isn't always a detour. Often, it's a signal. Not a signal that you failed, but that an old way of seeing life no longer fits. Think about this carefully. The deepest exhaustion doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from living by expectations that no longer feel true. When your motivation disappeared, it wasn't because you stopped caring. It was because part of you realized that chasing the same goals, using the same definitions of success, was costing you too much. That realization hurts, but it's also honest. Here's a quieter truth. Suffering often appears when you're outgrowing the story you were taught. You were taught to measure your life by progress, achievement, approval, and certainty. So when life becomes uncertain, slow, or painful, the whole structure collapses. What if the goal isn't to eliminate suffering? What if the real shift is learning to stop arguing with reality? Not hyping up, not becoming passive, just dropping the constant inner resistance that says, this shouldn't be happening. Because resistance multiplies pain. When you stop demanding that life feel fair before you allow yourself to move, something loosens. You don't suddenly feel happy, but you feel less trapped. And from that space, small actions become possible again. Not big plans, not dramatic transformations. Small, honest actions, like showing up today without needing to feel inspired, like taking one step that respects your current energy instead of shaming it, like choosing what is meaningful now, not what looks impressive later. This is where real motivation is reborn, not as excitement, but as quiet alignment. You stop asking, how do I get rid of this pain? And start asking, how do I live truthfully with it? Pain handled honestly becomes grounding instead of it slows you down enough to notice what actually matters. It strips away the need to prove yourself constantly, and slowly, almost unnoticed, you regain momentum. Not because life became easier, but because you stopped fighting what it is. That's the kind of strength no one teaches. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that lasts. There's a man I want to tell you about. Not someone famous, not someone extraordinary, just someone ordinary, like most of us. His name isn't important. What matters is where he was. In his mid-30s, his life looked fine from the outside. A steady job, a small apartment, people who assumed he was doing okay. But most mornings, he sat on the edge of his bed, feeling a quiet dread he couldn't explain. He wasn't depressed in the dramatic sense. He just felt empty. Years earlier, he had followed every rule he was given, studied what made sense, took the safe job, stayed responsible, waited for life to feel like it was supposed to, but instead of fulfillment, he felt worn down, like he was living someone else's outline. One evening, after another long day that felt identical to the last, he stayed late at the office, not to work, but because he didn't feel like going home. When the building emptied out, he sat alone under fluorescent lights and realized something that scared him. If nothing changed, this could be the rest of his life. That thought didn't motivate him. It crushed him. For months after that, he did the bare minimum. Not out of rebellion, but out of survival. He stopped making plans, stopped setting goals. He told himself he was taking a break, but really, he was lost. Then one small thing happened. On a weekend he couldn't fill with distractions. He went for a long walk with no destination. No podcast. No music. Just movement. At first, his mind raced. regrets, comparisons, worries. But eventually, it quieted, and in that quiet, a simple realization surfaced, not hopeful, not dramatic, just true. I've been trying to escape this feeling instead of listening to it. That didn't fix his life, but it changed how he treated himself. He stopped forcing motivation, stopped demanding clarity before taking action. Instead, he asked smaller questions. What feels honest today? What drains me the least? What matters even if no one notices? He started making tiny changes that didn't impress anyone. Leaving work earlier, saying no more often, doing one small thing each day that felt grounding instead of productive. Months passed, nothing miraculous happened, but something subtle shifted. He felt more present, less resentful, less fake. Eventually, he made a difficult choice to leave the job he once thought defined him. Not because he had a perfect alternative, but because staying had become unbearable. Life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became real. Years later, when asked how he found his way, he said something that stayed with me. I didn't overcome my suffering. I let it teach me what I couldn't ignore anymore. That's the part no one talks about. Sometimes the people who rise again aren't the ones who fought hardest. They're the ones who stopped pretending they were fine and started living in alignment with what hurt. Here is the truth about suffering that most people never tell you. Suffering is not the enemy of your life. It is the part of life that refuses to let you live dishonestly. Pain doesn't arrive to punish you. It arrives when something inside you knows that the old way of thinking, chasing, proving is no longer sustainable. And when you stop treating suffering like a mistake, it changes its role. It stops being something you have to escape and becomes something that points. It points to what you've been tolerating too long, to what you've been carrying that isn't yours anymore, to what matters enough to hurt when it's ignored. You don't need to turn this pain into a lesson today. You don't need to feel motivated tomorrow. You don't need to figure everything out. You only need one honest step. Not toward happiness, but toward truth. Because a life built on truth, even when it's uncomfortable, has a quiet strength to it. A steadiness, a sense of direction that doesn't rely on constant motivation. And one day, you may look back and realize something unexpected. The moment you thought you were falling apart was the moment you stopped lying to yourself. That wasn't the end of your strength. It was the beginning of a deeper kind. If this message stayed with you, let it stay. Save it. Share it with someone who might need it in a quiet moment. And remember this: when suffering speaks, it's not asking you to be stronger. It's asking you to be honest.